In the dark winter of 1944, a chilling message reached the Royal Air Force headquarters in England. From deep within occupied France, resistance operatives had smuggled out word that dozens of their comrades were imprisoned at Amiens, and their execution was imminent. Among them were men and women who knew too much. Names, dates, and fragments of the Allied invasion plans that could not fall into German hands. What began as a desperate plea for rescue soon escalated into one of the most daring and mysterious missions of the Second World War, Operation Jericho Amiens. Prisons stood like a fortress on the outskirts of the city. Thick, concrete walls, barbed wire, and machine gun towers under constant Gestapo supervision. Inside, over 700 prisoners languished in freezing cells. Many were French resistance members captured during crackdowns by the Sicherheitsdienst. Some were suspected of collaborating, others guilty of nothing more than smuggling messages for the Allies. Yet all faced the same fate, a firing squad scheduled for the coming weeks. In early February, a small group of British and Free French intelligence officers gathered at RAF Hunsdon in Hertfordshire. Their mission was to discuss the feasibility of a raid so bold it bordered on suicidal, to strike the prison itself from the air. The plan demanded surgical precision, destroy the outer walls to allow prisoners to escape, cripple the guards' quarters, and avoid killing the very men and women they sought to save. Only one aircraft could possibly deliver that level of control at low altitude and high speed, the de Havilland. Mosquito nicknamed the Wooden Wonder, the Mosquito was one of Britain's most versatile aircraft. Built from lightweight plywood and powered by twin Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, it could fly low enough to evade radar and fast enough to outrun most German fighters. To the men of No. 140 Wing, led by Group Captain Percy Charles Pickard, a decorated officer known for his calm under pressure, the Mosquito was both weapon and shield. But even Pickard hesitated when he read the mission brief. The raid would take place in broad daylight, at treetop level, over 150 miles of enemy territory. Straight through heavy anti-aircraft zones and winter fog, the crews would have only seconds to release their bombs, targeting sections of a building no wider than a school gymnasium. And worst of all, the Germans would expect retaliation. Any survivors could be hunted down almost immediately after the raid. Still, Pickard accepted the challenge. If it can save even a handful of those men, one of his pilots later recalled him saying, then we must at least try. In the following days, reconnaissance flights from the Photographic Reconnaissance Unit provided detailed images of the prison layout. The target map showed the north and east walls, key points for the initial breach. Each aircraft's crew received hand-drawn sketches marking where to drop their 500-pound bombs. It was a mission unlike any other, a combination of humanitarian rescue and military experiment. Even within the RAF, few were told of its full purpose. Among the participating squadrons were No. 464 Squadron, Royal Australian Air Force, No. 487 Squadron, Royal New Zealand Air Force, and No. 21 Squadron RAF. These composite units of Commonwealth airmen were known for precision strikes, and for their courage in operations that demanded both nerve and skill. Together, they would make up the strike force for Operation Jericho. Meanwhile, in occupied Amiens, word of the impending executions spread through the prison's dim corridors. Resistance inmates passed coded notes through cell walls, praying that their comrades outside would somehow intervene. Few could imagine that salvation might come from the sky. At RAF Hunsdon, final preparations began on February 17, 1944. Mechanics painted invasion stripes onto the Mosquitoes and loaded them with delayed action bombs designed to detonate seconds after impact, giving structures just enough time to collapse inward. The weather reports were grim, thick fog, low visibility, and bitter cold. But the window of opportunity was closing. A delay of even a few days could mean the death of hundreds. That night, in the crew quarters, airmen wrote letters home, many believing they might not return. "We're not supposed to talk about it," one navigator wrote in his diary. "But this one feels different. It's not just another target, it's people." By dawn, the engines roared to life. The Mosquitoes lifted from the frost-covered airfield, their twin propellers slicing through the morning mist. Group Captain Pickard's aircraft, code EGF, led the formation north across the English Channel. Below them lay fields of snow, rivers of fog, and a war-torn continent waiting for liberation. Their objective, Amiens Prison. Their mission, to break the unbreakable. And as the squadron crossed the French coast at barely 50 feet above ground, Radio silence still held. No one spoke. No one breathed too loudly. Every second counted. Operation Jericho was underway. But even among those who flew it, few understood the full truth of what they were about to do. The morning of February 18, 1944, was cloaked in fog thick enough to blur the horizon into a pale, endless wall. At RAF Hunsdon, engines groaned to life as mechanics and ground crew moved quickly through the mist, their silhouettes lit by the glow of navigation lamps. Despite the weather warnings, Group Captain Percy Pickard stood firm. The order was clear. Operation Jericho would proceed. Any delay could mean the execution of dozens of French prisoners by the Gestapo. There would be no second chance. At precisely 11 a.m., the first formation of de Havilland Mosquitoes from No. 487 Squadron, Royal New Zealand Air Force, took off, followed by the Australians of No. 464 Squadron, and finally Pickard's own No. 21 Squadron. Each aircraft carried 4 500-pound bombs, delayed action fuses set to explode moments after impact, allowing the bombers to escape the blast radius. Beneath their wings gleamed the dark green and grey camouflage of low-level intruders, designed to vanish against the countryside below. The crews flew at an altitude of barely 50 feet, hugging the earth as they crossed the English Channel toward the Somme Valley. Pilots dodged trees, spires, and power lines while skimming frozen rivers and snow-dusted fields. The roar of twin Merlin engines echoed across occupied France, fleeting thunder before disappearing into silence again. At this height, even a single miscalculation could send an aircraft into the ground. Yet, every man in the formation knew what was at stake. Inside his cockpit, Pickard maintained radio silence. His navigator, Flight Lieutenant Bill Broadley, studied his map through a red lamp's glow. Below them, resistance fighters hidden in the French countryside were already on the move. A small group from the Amiens underground had taken up positions near the prison, ready to guide escaped inmates to safety once the bombing began. They were armed with little more than hope, and the faith that the RAF would strike true. At 12 hours, the first wave approached Amiens. The city's outskirts were quiet, dusted in snow, with German troops patrolling the roads. Then, like shadows emerging from the clouds, the mosquitoes descended over the treetops. French witnesses later recalled the sight. They came so low we thought they would touch the rooftops. The ground shook before we even heard the bombs. The attack began at 12:03 p.m. precisely. Squadron leader Ian McCritchie led the first run, his Mosquito screaming in from the west at barely 10 meters above the ground. His bombs struck the northern wall of the prison with astonishing accuracy. The explosion tore a gaping hole through the perimeter, flinging debris across the snow. Seconds later, 2 more aircraft followed, targeting the eastern and southern walls. Inside the prison, cell doors burst open under the pressure wave. Dust and chaos filled the corridors. The guards' quarters were next. The second wave, led by No. 464 Squadron, dropped their ordnance directly onto the German barracks adjoining the prison yard. One bomb hit squarely on the canteen, wiping out the command post. Survivors later described prisoners running through the smoke, some barefoot, others half-dressed, shouting "Liberté!" as they climbed through shattered walls into the open fields beyond. But liberation came at a cost. Some bombs landed too, close to the cell blocks, collapsing sections of the prison and burying inmates under rubble. Still, hundreds escaped. An estimated 255 men fled into the countryside. Many were recaptured within days, some vanished entirely. Of those who survived, several would later testify to seeing RAF aircraft so low they could see the pilots' faces. The third wave was intended as cover, strafing German vehicles and response units converging on the site. Yet, the operation was not without confusion. Thick smoke obscured targets, and the radio silence made coordination nearly impossible. Some aircraft dropped late, others nearly collided, pulling out of their runs. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from Amiens' outskirts as German gunners finally reacted. Tracers sliced the air, one shell exploding close enough to rattle Pickard's cockpit. Still, the formation held together as they turned west for home. Behind them, Amiens prison burned, the walls breached, the Gestapo stunned, and hundreds of captives scattering into the frozen countryside. From a purely tactical standpoint, the mission was a success. The target destroyed, prisoners freed, and enemy command disrupted. But for those aboard the Mosquitoes, victory felt hollow. They had seen the devastation up close. Civilians wounded, prisoners dead, chaos everywhere. As the surviving aircraft regrouped at low altitude, Pickard broke radio silence for the first time. "Target hit," he confirmed tersely. "Prison breached, returning to base." His voice was calm, almost detached, the voice of a man who knew the hardest part was still ahead. Anti-aircraft batteries along the return route were now fully alert, and German fighters had scrambled from nearby airfields. The RAF's retreat would be a race against death. Back in Amiens, the fires raged as German officers arrived to re-establish control. Resistance couriers sprinted through the fields, collecting survivors and hiding them in barns and attics. For hours, the city echoed with distant gunfire as escapees fought to reach friendly lines. Above it all, the contrails of the retreating Mosquitoes faded into the winter sky, thin, silver scars vanishing into cloud. Operation Jericho had struck with the precision of legend, but as the aircraft crossed the Somme River, one Mosquito would not make it home, and with its fall, the story of Operation Jericho would take its most tragic and mysterious turn. When the final bombs struck Amiens prison, the earth trembled for miles around. Smoke and dust engulfed the structure as terrified guards stumbled through the wreckage. Inside, French prisoners shouted, prayed, and clawed at broken doors. For a few moments, there was only chaos. The thunder of collapsing walls, the whine of ricocheting debris, and the desperate cries of men who could scarcely believe what was happening. Through the shattered northern wall, sunlight pierced the haze. Inmates emerged into the cold February air, coughing and limping, their striped uniforms torn and bloodied. Some sprinted across open ground, slipping on ice as they fled toward the nearby woods. Others froze in terror, unsure whether the explosions marked liberation or execution. "We thought it was the end," one survivor later recalled. "But when I saw the blue and red circles on the plains, I knew it was the English." By 12:10 p.m., the main assault was complete. The once impenetrable prison now stood gutted. Walls breached, guard towers reduced to rubble. Fires spread through the courtyards as ammunition stores ignited. The Germans were in disarray, scrambling to re-establish control, but the escape was only beginning. Of the roughly 700 prisoners held in Amiens, more than 250 managed to break free in the minutes following the bombing. Some were quickly recaptured, others melted into the countryside with the help of resistance cells. Among them were members of the French Maquis, intelligence couriers, and political detainees. Men and women whose knowledge of underground networks was invaluable to Allied command. A few were never seen again. Resistance networks across the Somme had prepared for this moment, though only a handful knew of the operation in advance. They moved fast, directing fugitives to safe houses and farmsteads hidden along the rivers. Locals risked everything to shelter escapees. Many were discovered in the following days and executed by the Gestapo, their sacrifice buried in silence for decades. Inside the burning prison, the aftermath was catastrophic. The walls of Block A had collapsed inward, killing dozens of inmates trapped in their cells. Flames licked through shattered windows as snow fell through gaping holes in the roof. Yet amid the devastation, there was an undeniable sense of purpose. A small but vital blow struck against German occupation. By 12:20 p.m., the Mosquito squadrons were heading west, skimming above Amiens' rooftops as they exited the target zone. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire from nearby emplacements, sending bursts of tracer fire into the pale sky. One shell struck the rear fuselage of a 487 squadron aircraft, forcing it down in a nearby field. Both crewmen were captured, the first of many whose fate would remain uncertain for years. The rest of the formation pressed on toward the channel. Their fuel was low and visibility worsening. The pilots knew they had to keep altitude minimal. German radar was now alert, and Luftwaffe interceptors had been scrambled from Lille. For Group Captain Percy Pickard, flying Mosquito EGF, every second counted. He kept his engines at full throttle, weaving through the low clouds, scanning for threats. Behind them, Amiens lay in ruins. German forces poured into the city to reassert control, rounding up escaped prisoners and sealing off roads. Within hours, the Gestapo began interrogating civilians suspected of aiding the fugitives. Reports reached Paris that enemy aircraft flying extremely low have bombed Amiens prison in a reckless and deliberate attack. The Nazi propaganda machine quickly labelled it a barbaric act, proof, they claimed, of Allied indifference to French lives. Yet, in the shadows, the truth spread differently. Radio Londres broadcasted cryptic messages that night, hinting at a successful strike for liberty in northern France. Families of resistance members waited anxiously for word of their loved ones. Some received handwritten notes days later, smuggled across fields and rivers, confirming survival. For others, silence was all that remained. Back in England, the operation's success was recorded in terse language. Target destroyed. Objective achieved. Casualties unknown. There was no fanfare, no press release. Even among RAF officers, discussion of the mission was muted. Too many questions hung unanswered. Why had the order come from such high command? Who had selected Amiens, and for what true purpose? At Amiens itself, French civilians gathered at dawn the next day, staring at the blackened remains of the prison. Smoke still rose from the rubble. The acrid smell of explosives mixed with snow and ash. German soldiers guarded the site, forbidding entry, while trucks carried away the wounded and the dead. But hidden among the ruins, resistance agents were already searching. Not for prisoners, but for documents. Some claimed that the prison held not only resistance members, but also captured German informants, collaborators who knew of Allied infiltration in France. Others whispered of coded files stored within the warden's office, records that might have compromised the entire French underground. Whether those documents survived the bombing has never been proven. For the RAF crews heading home, there was no time to dwell on such mysteries. They were still deep in enemy airspace, and their survival depended on staying undetected. The men who had just pulled off one of the most daring raids of the war now faced an equally deadly challenge, escaping back to England. But as the Channel coast neared, disaster struck. A German FW-190 fighter was sighted near Abbeville, diving from the sun. Picard's Mosquito broke formation to evade it, and in that instant, his aircraft's luck ran out. A burst of flak exploded beneath them. The Mosquito shuddered violently, trailing black smoke. "EGF hit! EGF hit!" came the call over the radio. Moments later, the plane rolled onto its side and plunged toward the ground. From the other crews, all that was seen was a flash of fire and a plume of smoke rising from a field near St. Gratien. Group Captain Percy Pickard, hero of countless missions, would not return home. And with his death, the truth behind Operation Jericho began to slip into shadow. The wreckage of Group Captain Percy Pickard's Mosquito lay smouldering in a snowy field near the village of St. Gratien, just north of Amiens. It was February 18, 1944, the same day that would immortalize his name and yet shroud it in mystery. Local farmers rushed to the crash site, only to find both Pickard and his navigator, Flight Lieutenant Bill Broadley, killed on impact. Within hours, German patrols arrived, cordoned off the area, and confiscated all remains of the aircraft. To them, this was no ordinary loss. They had just downed one of the RAF's most recognizable heroes. Pickard had been a symbol of quiet courage long before Operation Jericho. Known for his modest demeanor and steady leadership, he had earned fame for his role in the 1942 Bruneval raid, and for his appearance in the wartime film Target for Tonight, where he played himself. His face, familiar to millions, had become a propaganda emblem of Allied determination. That such a man would die on a mission officially denied by his own government raised questions that would linger for decades. Back at RAF Hunsdon, the returning Mosquitoes landed one by one in the fading light. Ground crews counted them anxiously. One aircraft missing, then another. News spread quickly through the base. "Pickard's gone." The words hung heavy in the cold evening air. There was no victory celebration, no commendation. Instead, a veil of silence descended. The men who had risked their lives were ordered not to speak of the operation in detail. Their debriefing notes were brief, factual, and impersonal. Objective complete. Heavy anti-aircraft opposition. 2 aircraft lost. Nothing more. In Amiens, the aftermath was equally ambiguous. The Germans quickly took control of the ruined prison, rounding up as many escapees as they could. Within days, The Gestapo had recaptured over half of the fugitives. Many were executed on the spot, others sent to camps in Germany. Still, the operation had succeeded in freeing hundreds and in humiliating the Nazi security apparatus, which had failed to prevent such a precise strike. Yet, beneath that apparent success, darker theories began to surface. One of the most persistent rumors was that the true objective of Operation Jericho had not been the rescue of resistance members at all. Intelligence officers later hinted that certain prisoners inside Amiens might have been compromised, individuals who had revealed resistance networks under torture or who carried information that could endanger D-Day preparations. To some, the raid looked less like a rescue and more like a silencing. A convenient act of mercy, one post-war analyst wrote, for those who knew too much. Officially, none of this could be proven. The mission's origin was traced vaguely to a joint request from the French resistance and MI6, but no one ever identified the officer who approved it. Documents that might have explained the chain of command were either missing or classified for decades after the war. Even Air Marshal Basil Embry, who later oversaw similar precision strikes, admitted that Jericho's authorization remained a puzzle to all but a few. As the years passed, the story of the Amiens raid took on an almost mythic quality. French civilians remembered the bravery of the low-flying mosquitoes, calling them the angels of freedom. Survivors of the prison spoke of chaos, fire, and salvation, but also of friends buried alive beneath the rubble. The line between triumph and tragedy blurred, and Picard's death gave the operation a martyr's gravitas. To the public, he became the fallen hero who gave his life for France's freedom. But among the intelligence community, whispers persisted that the mission's official story was only half true. Pickard himself had left behind no personal notes about Operation Jericho. His wife, Dorothy, received only a brief telegram. "Deeply regret to inform you that your husband is missing, believed killed." For years, she sought answers, writing to his former comrades and commanding officers. Most could only reply with sympathy, not information. Even decades later, no detailed record of his final orders has ever been released. In 1945, as the war drew to a close, Allied investigators returned to Amiens to study the site. They found traces of bomb fragments, blast patterns consistent with low-level precision attacks, and fragments of RAF ordnance. But they also uncovered something more curious. The Germans had removed all official records from the prison before retreating. No lists of prisoners, no guard rosters, no execution schedules. It was as if the entire episode had been wiped clean. The French government later honored the operation as a symbol of Allied bravery, and memorials were erected for the fallen. But within the RAF, Operation Jericho was quietly buried in the archives, its files marked sensitive, restricted. Pickard's name was added to the Runnymede Memorial for airmen with no known grave. His mosquito, burned beyond recognition, was never recovered. For historians, the mystery only deepened with time. Why had an elite squadron risked so much for a target of limited military value? Why were post-mission reports so vague? And why had an operation so meticulously planned been conducted under weather conditions that all but guaranteed disaster? One RAF historian reviewing the files in the 1970s noted a single line scrawled in the margin of a planning memo. "Ensure absolute silence. Reason classified." The meaning of that note remains unknown. In the decades that followed, Operation Jericho became legend, half heroism, half enigma. The bravery of its pilots could never be questioned, but the purpose of their mission and the truth behind their orders would continue to divide historians and veterans alike. And as the fog of war settled once more over northern France, it seemed that the greatest secret of Amiens prison was not buried in its walls, but in the silence of those who sent the bombers there. In the years after the war, the world learned of the raid on Amiens through fragments, pieces of film, scattered testimonies, and official denials that only made the mystery deeper. To many, Operation Jericho was a masterpiece of precision and courage. To others, it was an operation without a clear cause. Somewhere between those versions lay the truth. But every attempt to uncover it led to more questions than answers. When the Allies liberated Amiens in 1944, they found little trace of the event beyond the rubble. German authorities had destroyed nearly all records of the prison and its inmates before retreating. What survived were eyewitness accounts, prisoners who escaped, resistance couriers who helped, and RAF crews who lived to tell their stories, but even their recollections contradicted one another. Some insisted that the prisoners were due for execution within hours, making the raid an act of mercy. Others said no such order had ever existed, that the bombing had come without warning, without necessity. After the war, RAF headquarters issued a short, sanitized statement. The Amiens raid was conducted in support of resistance forces under immediate threat of execution. Mission achieved. No further explanation followed. The official archives listed it as a tactical precision strike, not a rescue. This small but significant discrepancy fueled decades of speculation. Investigators began digging into wartime correspondence between MI6, the Special Operations Executive, SOE, and French resistance networks. The letters revealed that indeed, a request for assistance had been made by the resistance. But it was vague, more a plea than a plan. In January 1944, a message coded through London's Baker Street office spoke of imminent executions and urgent need for Allied intervention. Yet, no official authorization for a full-scale air raid was ever found. This raised an uncomfortable question. Who had given the order? Some historians pointed to Air Vice Marshal Basil Embry, then commander of the 2nd Tactical Air Force, who was known for unconventional low-level raids. But Embry denied involvement. Others suspected that the directive came from MI6, bypassing normal RAF channels to conceal intelligence objectives. A few even claimed that Operation Jericho had been intended not to save resistance members but to destroy them, those who had been compromised under torture or had become liabilities to Allied intelligence. Networks. Jericho, wrote British War historian Paul Brickhill, was either one of the war's most daring acts of compassion or its most calculated act of silence. Post-war investigations deepened the intrigue. Analysts discovered that several prisoners in Amiens had been arrested for leaking information about Allied invasion plans. Their knowledge of D-Day landing sites and agent identities made them dangerous to both sides. Some files suggested that these individuals were being interrogated by the Gestapo, but also monitored by British intelligence. If they were ever liberated, or recaptured by the Germans, the consequences could have been catastrophic. Was Jericho a desperate attempt to control information before the invasion? The evidence was circumstantial, but haunting. Adding to the mystery, several of the Mosquito pilots later recalled unusual secrecy surrounding the mission briefing. "We were told nothing," one veteran from No. 464 Squadron said. "Just that it was a special target and that accuracy was critical." Pickard looked worried, not nervous, but as if he didn't believe everything he'd been told. For decades, the RAF refused to release the full mission files. Only in the 1960s did fragments emerge through the Public Records Office. Even then, critical documents, including the operation's original authorization and post-strike intelligence summaries, were missing or marked destroyed. When questioned, the Ministry of Defense insisted this was standard wartime procedure. Few historians believed that explanation. Meanwhile, the French view of Jericho evolved into legend. Local commemorations honored the bravery of the RAF crews, particularly Pickard and Broadley. Survivors of the prison placed flowers at the crash site every year, calling them liberators of the condemned. But within the French resistance community, debate persisted. Some saw the raid as a blessing. Others called it a massacre that killed as many innocents as it saved. In 1986, the BBC aired a documentary investigating the operation's true motives. It revealed new testimonies from former SOE officers who hinted that the raid had a dual purpose: part rescue, part intelligence suppression. One officer, interviewed anonymously, stated, "We were not just trying to save people, we were trying to stop something from being exposed, something that could have undone D-Day." He refused to elaborate. That documentary reignited public fascination. Newspapers ran headlines such as, "Was Jericho a secret assassination?" and with a raid the RAF tried to forget. The Ministry of Defense dismissed these claims, maintaining the official line that the raid was humanitarian, but the controversy refused to die. Every newly declassified file seemed to hint at something more. Names redacted, orders unsigned, and communications that vanished between MI6 and Air Ministry archives. Even today, military historians remain divided. Some believe that Operation Jericho was a prototype for precision bombing, a tactical test for methods later used in Normandy. Others argue that the timing and secrecy of the raid suggest a darker agenda. The truth may lie buried beneath decades of bureaucratic erasure and wartime necessity. For the airmen who flew it, however, the mission was neither politics nor theory. It was personal. They followed orders, risked everything, and lost their leader in the process. Their courage was unquestionable. Their understanding of what they were truly part of, incomplete. In the quiet villages of Picardy, where the ruins of Amiens prison once stood, locals still tell the story. They speak of the thunder of engines, the low-flying silhouettes, and the shock of the prison walls crumbling in the snow. To them, it was a moment of liberation, no matter the reason behind it. But for historians sifting through the scattered records, Operation Jericho remains a paradox, a mission born in urgency, carried out with brilliance, and buried beneath secrecy. The files, they say, may never reveal the full truth. Yet as new evidence surfaced decades later in long classified documents hidden deep within British archives, it became clear that the mystery of Operation Jericho was far from over. For decades, the full truth behind Operation Jericho remained buried in government vaults, its fragments scattered through RAF reports, MI6 correspondence, and fading memories of those who survived it. What little the public knew came from official statements. The raid had freed French patriots, the pilots were heroes, and the loss of Group Captain Percy Pickard was a noble sacrifice. But history, as it often does, had written its own version of events, one that didn't always match the official record. By the 1970s, historians and journalists began pressing for the release of classified documents related to the operation. They sought answers to long-standing questions. Who authorized the mission, and why? What exactly were the prisoners' identities, and what did they know? And perhaps most crucially, what was Pickard told before he took off that morning in February 1944? The files that were eventually released shed light on some of these mysteries, but deepened others. Among the declassified papers were memoranda between the Air Ministry and the Special Operations Executive, SOE. One, dated February 8, 1944, 10 days before the raid, referred cryptically to urgent containment measures in the Amiens sector and noted that timely intervention may serve multiple purposes. The phrase multiple purposes was underlined twice. To some researchers, this hinted that Operation Jericho may have been a multi-layered mission, both a rescue and a covert strike to eliminate sensitive intelligence risks. Another discovery came from the archives of the Free French Forces in London. A dispatch sent by a resistance liaison officer, codenamed Monique, mentioned that several captured operatives in Amiens had previously worked with British agents. Some, she wrote, were in danger of being forced to disclose landing zone designations. If true, that placed the raid within the broader shadow of Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion planned just months later. The notion that Jericho might have been linked to D-Day, security sent shockwaves through the historical community. Was the RAF, knowingly or not, sent to destroy not just a prison, but the evidence, and perhaps the witnesses, of a larger intelligence breach? The idea was unsettling, yet consistent with the strange secrecy that had surrounded the mission from the start. Not all were convinced. Veteran pilots who flew the Mosquitoes dismissed these theories as cynical. "We were told it was a rescue mission," one surviving navigator recalled. "We saw the prisoners running free. That was enough." To them, the speculation dishonored the memory of Pickard and his men, who had risked and lost their lives believing they were saving others. But for historians, the contradictions were impossible to ignore. In 2004, a final wave of declassified intelligence summaries brought one more piece to the puzzle. A field report from the French Bureau, Centrale de Renseignement et d'Action, BCRA, the Free French Intelligence Agency, confirmed that several prisoners liberated from Amiens had indeed carried information about resistance structures in Normandy. Some of those men later rejoined the fight. Others vanished without a trace. One entry, dated March 1944, contained a single chilling line. Certain survivors removed for questioning. Destination unknown. No follow-up was ever found. These revelations did not solve the mystery. Instead, they reframed it. Operation Jericho was neither a simple act of compassion nor a calculated assassination. It was a collision of necessity, secrecy, and sacrifice. A mission that achieved its objective, but left behind moral and historical ambiguities that no document could fully resolve. The legacy of the raid endures in more than records and reports. Each year, the people of Amiens gather at the site of the old prison, where a simple memorial stone bears the names of those who died, prisoners and airmen alike. Flowers are laid for Pickard and Broadley, for the civilians caught in the bombing, and for the hundreds who seized their chance at freedom amid smoke and snow. Veterans who visit speak not of mystery or controversy, but of courage. "They flew low for us," one French survivor once said quietly. "They did not know our names, but they came." Today, historians continue to debate Operation Jericho's true intent. Was it a humanitarian rescue or an act of wartime calculation? The documents tell part of the story. The rest lies in the silence between the lines, in the unrecorded conversations, the burned orders, and the final moments of a mosquito spiraling through the cold air of northern France. As the decades stretch into history, one truth remains unshaken. The men who carried out the raid did so with precision, discipline, and extraordinary bravery. Their mission, whatever its hidden motives, reflected the chaos and complexity of a world at war, where mercy and strategy often intertwined in ways only time could unravel. And so, Operation Jericho remains one of World War II's most haunting enigmas. A daring rescue that may have concealed a darker purpose, a triumph built on tragedy, and a story that, even 80 years later, refuses to be fully told.